The first time he heard them laugh, he told himself it was only the sound of men trying to stay alive. It was still dark at the edge of the airfield, the kind of English darkness that seemed soaked into the hedgerows and the wet grass. The dispersal huts lay low and tired under a sky with no stars, and the wind carried the thin, constant smell of petrol and cold metal. Inside one of the huts, the stove ticked faintly and gave off more smoke than heat. A few men leaned over mugs of tea that tasted of tin, their shoulders hunched, their faces already set into the shapes they wore on operations. Someone had pinned yesterday's weather chart to the wall and stabbed it with a pencil, as if the act could hold the clouds in place. The room had the quiet of repetition, the ritual of a unit that had done this so many times that even nervousness had become a habit. Pilot Officer Tom Halstead sat on a bench near the door, helmet on his knees, gloves folded carefully beside it, as though neatness could substitute for experience. He was 21, tall in a way that still looked unfinished, and he carried himself with an almost stubborn caution. The older pilots read that caution as reluctance, and in the air war reluctance looked too much like fear. Halstead had flown only a handful of sorties with the squadron, enough to learn how the others moved around each other in the sky, enough to learn that confidence could be loud, but not enough to be included in the unspoken fraternity that formed between men who had watched friends fail to come back. His logbook had ink in it, but not the weight of names crossed out. Across the room, a flight lieutenant with weathered eyes and a mustache that had survived more winters than Halstead could count tapped ash into a tin and smirked as another pilot described Halstead's last landing. "He brought her in like she was made of glass," the man said, and the laughter was not cruel, not entirely. It was the laughter of men who teased because the alternative was to talk plainly about what they were about to do. A few heads turned toward Halstead, expecting him to grin and give something back. He did, a small smile that held no heat, and looked down at his gloves again. He had learned quickly that arguing only confirmed the label. Better to absorb it, to remain quiet, to be the new man until he was. On the wall behind them, a board listed the squadron's aircraft by letter and serial number. Beside several letters were small marks, chalk lines that looked like nothing until you knew what they counted. A month earlier, there had been more lines under certain names. Then those names had stopped appearing. The math of losses lived in those tiny marks, in the empty chair where someone used to sit, in the way jokes fell flat when they drifted too close to a memory. This is just one chapter of a much larger war. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines so you don't miss the next one. The squadron had been in the business of escorting bomber formations deeper and deeper into occupied Europe, walking them over rail yards and oil refineries, over the clenched heart of the Reich, and bringing back as many as possible. They had learned what flak looked like from the air, how it blossomed black in neat puffs, how it filled the sky like a field of poisonous flowers. They had learned that German fighters could appear from sunlight like thrown knives, and that a single mistake in formation could widen into a catastrophe. The briefing began without ceremony. A staff officer stepped to the front, unfolded a map, and the room tightened in the way it always did when the war's abstract lines became tomorrow's route. The map showed the channel, the narrow ribbon of water that separated the island from the continent, and then the spiderweb of France, Belgium, and Western Germany. A grease pencil traced a path inland, a line that avoided certain concentrations of anti-aircraft guns and skirted known fighter fields. The target was not named dramatically, just a grid reference and a town that meant nothing to Halstead. The veterans, however, exchanged brief looks. They knew what lay there: a rail junction, an industrial plant, a node in the German machine that kept divisions supplied. It was one more thread to cut, one more place where bombers would be vulnerable and fighters would be summoned. The staff officer spoke about altitude and timing, about rendezvous points and radio frequencies. He used the measured voice of someone who had learned to keep emotion out of the numbers. Bombers stream at 20,000 feet, he said. Escort will weave above 25000 to 28,000. Expect contrails. Weather over target, scattered cloud, base 6,000, tops 12,000, wind from the west. He mentioned the flak, moderate to heavy, as if describing traffic. He mentioned possible fighter opposition. BF-109s, FW-190s, maybe a staffel of something newer if they were unlucky. He did not say the one sentence everyone carried anyway. If you went down over there, you were on your own. Halstead listened and forced himself to picture each stage. He had done T. Training, the classrooms thick with cigarette smoke, the instructors with clipped voices, the chalk diagrams of attacks and evasions. He had flown in England until the sky felt like a familiar room. But training did not include the particular dryness in the mouth that came when a route line crossed the continent and didn't come back until it touched England again. Training did not include the knowledge that men with your surname had been missing from the mess for weeks. Training did not include the feeling of being measured by people who could already read your future and your posture. After the briefing, the pilots drifted outside into the pre-dawn damp. The airfield lay in half-light, a patchwork of hard standings and narrow tracks, each leading to a camouflaged aircraft crouched like an animal waiting to spring. Ground crews moved among them with practice speed, their overalls smeared with oil, their hands stiff from cold and work. They were already awake, already carrying the war in their muscles. One man held a ladder while another leaned into a cockpit checking instruments with a torch. A third rolled a trolley of ammunition belts, the links glinting faintly, each cartridge a small promise of violence. Somewhere a starter cart coughed and whined, and an engine turned over with a reluctant churn, then caught, the propeller flashing into a blur that tore the silence into pieces. Halstead walked toward his aircraft with his crew chief, a stocky corporal who had the blunt patience of someone responsible for keeping young men alive. The fighter was a P-51 Mustang, its skin cold and smooth under Halstead's fingertips, painted in dull camouflage with invasion stripes from months earlier still faintly visible. The name of the aircraft was stenciled beneath the canopy in small, careful letters, chosen by someone who wanted to give the machine a personality, to make it more than a serial number. Halstead had not picked the name. He had inherited it, as he had inherited everything else about this squadron's war. The corporal pointed out minor issues in the way men discussed such things with matter-of-fact acceptance. New plugs went in yesterday, he said. Oil's good, hydraulics checked, guns were cleaned after last op. He paused, and for a moment his eyes met Halstead's with something close to concern. Don't ride the engine too hard on climb, he added. Let her warm, she'll look after you if you look after her. It was not superstition, not really. It was the closest thing to prayer that ground crews allowed themselves. Around them, other pilots were climbing into cockpits, their movements efficient, almost indifferent. The veterans had a way of inhabiting their aircraft as if stepping into a familiar coat. Halstead took longer, checking straps and buckles, making sure the parachute sat right, making sure the oxygen hose connected. He knew the ritual mattered. In a world where so much could go wrong without warning, the parts you could control became sacred. He ran his hand along the throttle, the mixture control, the switches. He touched the gun button on the stick and felt nothing, just a small piece of metal, but his mind supplied the rest. The .50 caliber guns in the wings, the belts of ammunition, the violent chatter when they fired. He imagined them working perfectly because imagining failure was a luxury he couldn't afford. As dawn began to thin the darkness, the squadron lined up for taxi. Engines idled and then rose, the airfield filling with the hard, steady roar that vibrated in the bones. Prop wash flattened grass and threw grit against the wings. The Mustangs rolled forward in sequence, tail wheels bouncing slightly over uneven ground, each aircraft following the one ahead with careful spacing. Halstead kept his eyes moving, checking wingtips, watching for the marshal's signals, feeling the aircraft's response through rudder and brakes. The cockpit smelled of leather, rubber, and faint exhaust. The canopy trapped his breath and made his world feel smaller, more intimate, as if the war had narrowed to the instruments and the strip of runway ahead. At the end of the runway, the lead aircraft paused. In that pause, there was a peculiar stillness, the last moment when it was possible to imagine turning back. Halstead looked left and right at the other fighters, their pilots hidden behind glass and oxygen masks. Somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, the countryside slept, unaware of the drama about to lift off its soil. Halstead tightened his grip on the stick and tried to make his heartbeat match the engine's rhythm. The laughter from the hut seemed distant now, as if it belonged to another life. What lay ahead would not care whether he was cautious or bold. It would only respond to what he did when the sky turned hostile. The green flare went up, pale against the morning, and the squadron began to move. The Mustang leapt forward with a suddenness that always felt faintly unreal, as if the ground had lost its claim without warning. Halstead held the nose straight with firm pressure on the rudder, the tail lifting as the air began to bite into the elevators, and then the wheels stopped rumbling and the aircraft was simply flying, climbing into a dawn that looked innocent from a distance and cruel up close. The runway fell away into a patchwork of frost-dark grass and taxiways, then into hedged fields and thin roads. He kept the climb shallow at first, letting the Merlin warm, watching the coolant temperature needle creep toward its steady place. The engine's vibration came through the seat and into his spine, a steady mechanical pulse that threatened to mask everything else, including fear. Over the radio, clipped voices confirmed altitude, heading, and the first small corrections that kept a squadron from becoming a loose handful of solitary men. Cloud lay in broken layers, low enough to make the horizon uncertain. The weather officer had promised scattered cover, but the sky did not care about promises. It offered long gray smears that forced the formation to thread through gaps, climbing and turning with care so as not to lose anyone in the murk. Halstead's canopy filmed slightly at the edges where his breath warmed the cold glass. He adjusted the air vents and felt a thin stream of chilled air against his cheek. At 5,000 feet, the land already looked flatter, quieter, a place that could be mistaken for peace if you ignored the hardening sound of engines and the fact that every aircraft carried its own ending inside it. He checked his wing position, measuring distance by sight and instinct. Close enough to be useful, far enough to avoid collision if someone jerked suddenly. The veterans did this as naturally as walking. Halstead had to think about it, and thinking in the air was expensive. They climbed toward the rendezvous point over the coast, where the escort fighters would meet the bombers. The fuel gauge mattered now, not in the abstract way it had mattered in training, but as an iron boundary drawn in the sky. A Mustang could range far, but only if it was treated properly. Mixture adjusted, throttle set with discipline, unnecessary maneuvers avoided. Halstead kept an eye on manifold pressure and RPM, listening for any change in tone that might hint at trouble. The thought of being forced to turn back early, to peel away alone, made his stomach tighten. The squadron's teasing would come back with teeth if he returned without having been tested. Yet the war did not reward pride. It rewarded men who made correct decisions before they were trapped by wrong ones. At 10,000 feet, the cold became a physical presence, seeping through gloves and boots despite thick socks and heated suits. Halstead tested his oxygen flow and felt the faint medicinal tang of it in his breath. He had been taught that hypoxia was a thief that came softly, stealing judgment before it stole consciousness. And he watched himself for signs, tingling fingers, warmth where there should be cold, a strange lightness. The veterans seemed to carry their bodies differently at altitude, more relaxed, as if their nerves had learned to conserve energy. Halstead's shoulders remained tense. He forced them down, loosened his grip on the stick, and told himself to fly the aircraft rather than wrestle it. The English coast slid beneath them, pale cliffs and a thin line of surf. Beyond lay the channel, dark and rippled, a sheet of cold that hid wrecks and bodies with equal indifference. The formation tightened as they approached it, the lead aircraft giving small wing dips that signaled adjustments without wasting words. Halstead felt the subtle change in air as they moved out over water, the atmosphere smoother, the horizon wider. The sense of leaving home was not sentimental. It was practical, like stepping from solid ground onto a bridge that might hold or might not. He watched for the first specks that would be bombers, knowing they would appear gradually, the sky filling with them until it seemed impossible that so much metal could hang in air. They arrived at the rendezvous at the Tim. E written on the board, and the bombers were already there. B-17s and B-24s flew in layered streams, box formations stacked at different altitudes, each aircraft a squat, heavy shape with sunlight flashing off its wings. Exhaust trails stretched behind them like chalk marks across the morning. From Halstead's position above and slightly behind, they looked slow and steady, almost peaceful, but he knew what sat inside them. Men compressed into thin aluminum, surrounded by fuel and bombs, depending on guns and formation discipline, the way a drowning man depends on a plank. The fighters slid into escort positions, weaving gently to keep from becoming predictable. It was not bravado, it was geometry and survival. The Luftwaffe could time attacks against steady escorts. A weaving screen forced attackers to guess. Halstead's world narrowed to his assigned place in the pattern, his eyes moving in a constant scan, left, right, above, below, then back to the bombers. He checked his guns again, running through the procedure without firing. Arm switches set, ammunition counters. He imagined the belts feeding smoothly, each round sliding into place. He tried not to think about stoppages, misfeeds, the tiny failures that could turn a machine into dead weight. Over the radio, the squadron leader spoke rarely, his voice calm. He reminded them of the rules of engagement. Do not chase a single enemy aircraft away from the bombers. Do not break formation unless ordered. Do not be tempted into the clouds where flak and fighters could isolate you. The rules were simple because the air was complicated. The coast of France came into view, a darker line beyond the water, and with it came the first subtle change in the atmosphere of the formation. The veterans' heads seemed to tilt, their scanning becoming sharper. Halstead felt it too, the shift from transit to threat. Anti-aircraft fire began as distant black puffs at lower altitude, not aimed at them yet but present like the first cough of a storm. The bombers held course. Escort fighters climbed slightly to maintain an advantage, because altitude in air combat was energy, and energy was choice. The channel had been a boundary. Now they crossed into a sky shaped by enemy calculation. As they pressed inland, contrails formed above them, thin white lines that marked their presence for anyone looking up. The sun climbed higher and turned the cloud tops into bright plates, making the shadows beneath them darker. Halstead's eyes watered slightly from the glare. He adjusted his mask and blinked hard. Over the radio came small fragments from other flights, calls that meant something to those who understood the language of procedure. Bandits reported. Angels 25, Vector 270. The words were neutral, but Halstead could feel the tension rising in their spacing, in the way a wingman drifted closer, then corrected, as if preparing for abrupt turns. The first enemy fighters did not arrive with drama. They were simply there, small dark shapes far off at first, gliding on the edge of vision. Halstead spotted them only because one of the veterans called out a position relative to the sun. He followed the line with his eyes and saw the specks resolve into aircraft, too far for markings, but moving with purpose, climbing to meet them. The Luftwaffe pilots used height and sun the way a hunter used cover. The enemy formation broke into smaller elements, spreading and turning, testing. Halstead felt his mouth go dry again. His hands tightened on the stick despite his effort to remain loose. Now the work began. The squadron leader gave short, precise commands and the fighters adjusted. Halstead matched the movements of his element leader, keeping station while the formation shifted its weave. He learned quickly that combat started long before firing. It began with position, with the angle of approach, with denying the enemy an easy line. The veteran pilots watched not only the enemy but the bombers, the clouds, the flak bursts below that hinted at gun concentrations. They read the sky the way sailors read waves. Halstead had to force himself to do the same, to think in 3 dimensions, to anticipate where an attacking fighter would want to go and how to block that path. The enemy made a probing pass at the bomber stream, not committing fully, perhaps measuring the escort. Halstead saw a pair of fighters dive from above, their wings flashing, then pull up as tracers reached for them from bomber guns. The escort fighters rolled and dipped in response, but did not chase recklessly. Halstead's element slid to cover the bomber's vulnerable side, closing the distance slightly. He could see the bomber's dorsal turrets rotate, the tiny movements of men inside. Somewhere down there, gunners tracked the same specs, their fingers on triggers, their fear contained by procedure. Halstead's responsibility became real in a way it had not been on the ground. If he drifted too far. From his wingman, he created a gap. A gap invited an attack. If he fixated on one enemy aircraft, he might miss another slipping into position. He forced his eyes to keep moving, to resist the tunnel vision that came with adrenaline. He checked his engine instruments again, because losing power at this moment would be its own kind of death. He felt the aircraft respond to small inputs, solid and eager, and he took a strange comfort in that steadiness. The Mustang did not care that he was new. It only cared about airspeed and control. They flew deeper into occupied territory, with the bomber stream steady beneath them and enemy fighters now circling at the edge of engagement. Halstead could feel the veterans' patience, their refusal to be drawn into a chaotic melee that would leave the bombers exposed. The sky held its breath in a way that only men could sense, a pause made of intention on both sides. Halstead stayed in position, breathing oxygen, watching the specks grow and separate, understanding that his job was not to be heroic but to be present, to hold his place in a structure that kept men alive. The laughter from the hut felt even farther away now, replaced by the blunt knowledge that in this sky, every small decision mattered. The enemy's caution did not last. Over the patchwork fields and thin rivers of western Germany, the Luftwaffe fighters began to shape their attack with the economy of men who had done it 100 times. They stayed high, just outside the most comfortable turning radius of the escorts, and used the sun as a curtain. Halstead watched the specks arrange themselves into pairs, then fours, then a longer line that curved like a sickle above the bomber stream. The escort leader's voice came over the radio, calm and clipped, assigning sectors and reminding everyone to hold discipline. Halstead felt the familiar urge to do something decisive, anything to keep the sky from tightening around them. But he also felt the weight of the rules that existed because men had died learning why they were necessary. A burst of flak rose below the bombers, black puffs that looked soft but carried jagged fragments. The bombers stayed in their boxes, their trails thickening as engines strained to hold altitude in disturbed air. The escorts wove above and around them, a moving fence. Halstead kept station on his element leader's right wing, his distance measured by the leader's fuselage and the angle of his tailplane. His eyes flicked to his instruments, then out again, repeating the cycle like a prayer. Airspeed steady, coolant temperature stable, oxygen flowing, fuel dropping slowly but predictably. He checked the gun switches again, thumb pressing the safety and arming toggles as if the extra touch would make the machine more obedient. The first real push came fast. A group of FW-190s rolled over and dived toward the bomber stream, their approach steep enough to build speed and shallow enough to keep options open. Halstead saw the moment they committed because their silhouettes sharpened and grew, and their contrails vanished as they dropped into denser air. Tracers began to rise from the bombers, thin white lines arcing upward, while other escort fighters peeled away to intercept. The radio filled with short calls, positions, headings, warnings, each one clipped to the bare minimum because breath and time were limited resources. Halstead heard his element leader call, "2 bandits diving 11 o'clock high," and then the leader rolled left, nose dipping to meet them. Halstead followed, feeling the Mustang's response as the horizon tilted. The G-force pressed him into the seat, not yet heavy but firm enough to remind him that his body was part of the machine. He kept his wing position as they descended, trying not to slide wide or cut too close. The enemy fighters were now distinct shapes, wide-winged and compact, crossing their path. Halstead saw flashes from their wings as they fired at the bombers, then began to pull up. If they escaped intact, they would climb again and come back. The intercept was a window measured in seconds. The element leader lined up on the trailing Focke-Wulf. Halstead did the same, slightly offset, the way he had been taught, to avoid both pilots firing through the same lane. The enemy aircraft filled more of his windscreen. He could see the dark cross on the wings now, the canopy glint, the slight roll as the pilot tried to spoil the aim. Halstead's breathing quickened, oxygen hissing faintly. He remembered the range lessons, the need to close before firing, the way bullets dropped and spread. He felt a sharp clarity in his mind, as if everything else had been stripped away. He pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. For a fraction of a second, his brain refused to accept it. His thumb squeezed again, harder, as if force could overcome mechanics. Still nothing. No shudder of recoil, no flicker of muzzle flash, no faint smell of cordite seeping into the cockpit. The silence was wrong in a way that made his skin prickle. The FW-190 slid across his sights. Still alive, still dangerous, and Halstead realized that the difference between him and a spectator was supposed to be 8.50 caliber guns that were now simply dead weight. Training provided a script, but in the air, scripts came late. His hands moved automatically to the controls he had been taught to use. He checked the master arm switch, verified the gun switches, and tried the trigger again. He looked at the ammunition counters, expecting some sign of life, but the needles stayed fixed. A stoppage drill existed for some failures, cycling the gun heater, switching firing circuits, changing the rate. Yet none of it seemed to translate into immediate action. The aircraft bucked slightly in turbulent air from the dive, and the enemy fighter pulled up, escaping behind a haze of smoke from a bomber's engines. Halstead's first instinct was shame, hot and immediate. He imagined the veterans' faces if they knew he had lined up a shot and produced nothing. He imagined the laughter returning, sharper now. But the air did not allow him to sit in that feeling. Another pair of German fighters came down, this time angling toward the bomber's flank, looking for a gap. Halstead's element leader broke toward them, and Halstead had to choose in a heartbeat what kind of wingman he could be without guns. He stayed close. It was not heroism. It was refusal to become useless. He tucked in tighter than he normally would, close enough that his leader could not ignore his presence, close enough that any enemy pilot considering an attack would see 2 Mustangs instead of one. Halstead knew he could not kill anyone, but he could still occupy space. He could still force a German pilot to hesitate to guess. In the air, hesitation was sometimes enough. The escort leader's voice cut through the radio again, directing fighters to the bomber stream's rear where another attack was forming. Halstead's leader acknowledged and turned. Halstead followed, adjusting T. Throttled to keep position, trying to appear as steady and capable as if his guns were working. Every few seconds he tried the trigger again, not expecting miracles but unable to stop himself. The gun button felt like an accusation under his thumb. As they climbed back toward the bombers, the fight widened. Tracers crisscrossed the sky in brief, bright threads. A bomber's wing flashed with a burst of black smoke where flak or cannon shells had struck. Halstead saw parachutes far below, small white flowers opening against the dark earth, and he forced himself not to follow them with his eyes. Looking down too long could be fatal. German fighters used distraction the way a boxer used a feint. He focused on process. Airspeed 260 mph, altitude climbing through 22,000 feet, coolant temperature steady, fuel still enough but less than he wanted. Oxygen flow confirmed. He took one deep breath and tried the stoppage drill again, cycling the circuit, switching to the alternate trigger path, checking that the gun heating system was engaged in the cold. The aircraft gave him no feedback. The guns remained silent. The failure felt personal, even though it was mechanical, as if he had been exposed as an imposter by his own equipment. Then the Germans came again, closer this time, with more intent. A pair of Bf-109s dove through the escort screen and aimed directly for a bomber that had drifted slightly out of alignment. Halstead saw the bomber's vulnerable position immediately, the tiny separation that looked insignificant but created an opening. The bomber's gunners fired, but their tracers lagged behind the fast-moving fighters. Halstead's leader rolled to intercept, and Halstead matched him, though he knew he could not contribute with fire. The intercept turned into a high-speed crossing. The Bf-109s flashed past, close enough that Halstead could see the angular tail and the pale spinner. In a working Mustang, this would be the moment to squeeze the trigger and cut one down as it climbed away. Instead, Halstead held his line and pressed in anyway, using speed and proximity to force the German pilots to react. He stayed on their tails just long enough to make them brake harder than they wanted, their climb turning into a defensive spiral. Halstead could not shoot, but he could still chase, still signal to the enemy that they were not free to linger. His leader fired, tracers streaming out, and one German fighter rolled away. Halstead watched the movement closely, ready to warn his leader if another enemy slipped in. He knew that if his leader was hit, Halstead's own guns would not save him. He would be a wingman who could only watch. The thought tightened his chest more than the cold. He keyed the radio briefly, keeping his voice steady. "Guns in op," he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. He did not add excuses. He did not elaborate. The channel was crowded and time was short. His leader's reply came after a pause that felt longer than it was. "Stay on me," the voice said. No ridicule, no surprise, only instruction. The simplicity of it steadied Halstead more than sympathy would have. For the next minutes, the fight became a chain of decisions built on imperfect information. The escort shifted to cover different sectors as the Germans probed for weak points. Halstead stayed close to his leader, doubling his scan, trying to be a better set of eyes to compensate for being an empty set of guns. He called out a diving fighter once, and his leader broke just in time to avoid a firing pass. He watched a bomber take hits and keep flying, its formation holding through damage because breaking away would invite worse. He watched another bomber lag and then fall behind, swallowed gradually by distance and cloud. Halstead's own fear changed shape. At first it had been about being laughed at, about being exposed as the cautious rookie. Now it became something colder, the knowledge that if an enemy fighter chose him, he would have fewer options. Guns were not only for killing, they were for bargaining. A working aircraft could threaten. A broken one could only evade. He felt that asymmetry like a weight. Yet he kept flying his position because there was nothing else to do. Pride had no place here, only function. The guns stayed jammed, the war went on around him, and he remained in the sky with the same job as everyone else. Protect the bombers, protect the formation, stay alive long enough to land and try again. The jam did not feel like a single failure anymore. It felt like a condition that followed Halstead through every turn, every climb, every glance at the bomber stream. He tried not to touch the trigger again, but his thumb kept returning to it in small, unconscious squeezes, as if the guns might suddenly remember their purpose. Each time the silence answered, and each time he forced his attention back to the things that still worked. The Mustang's engine held steady. The controls remained crisp. The airspeed. D stayed where he put it. The enemy was real, and so were the bombers beneath, their formation stretching ahead in layered boxes, a slow-moving industrial caravan that could not dodge quickly and could not hide. He ran the stoppage drill again, this time carefully, not in panic. He checked the gun heating switch, imagining the wing bays where cold air seeped into mechanisms designed in warmer rooms. He switched the firing circuit from one position to the other, then back, listening for any change in the aircraft that might hint at electrical life. He watched the ammeter for a flicker. He saw none. He considered the possibility that it was not electrical at all, that a belt had slipped or a feed tray had jammed, that vibration and G-load had shaken a link just enough to stop the chain. There was no way to open a wing at 25,000 feet and fix it with gloved fingers. The aircraft gave him what it gave him, and the rest was improvisation. The squadron's weave carried them toward heavier flak zones as the bombers approached their target area. The ground below looked more organized now, straighter roads, thicker rail lines, clusters of buildings with the hard geometry of German industry. Halstead watched black bursts climb toward the bombers, the puffs forming at roughly the same altitude, and then trailing gray smoke as the wind pulled them apart. Flak had a rhythm of its own, not like gunfire, but like a slow, brutal punctuation. It forced formations into predictability. Bomber commanders tried to hold course to keep bomb aim steady, which meant fighters could anticipate where the stream would be and when it would turn. The escorts had to cover those moments because they were when the enemy would try to strike hardest. A call came over the radio from a different flight, warning of fighters assembling high to the east. Halstead followed his leader's gaze and saw them, a loose, shimmering collection of specks against the bright cloud tops. They were not diving yet. They were waiting, building a picture of the escort screen and searching for an opening. Halstead's leader adjusted their element's position slightly outward, away from the bombers, creating a broader arc of protection. Halstead stayed close, careful not to overshoot, because being too eager with the throttle could leave him ahead and exposed, and being too cautious could leave him lagging and irrelevant. The tactical picture widened in Halstead's mind the way maps widened in the briefing room. He saw how the bombers' boxes created blind angles and overlapping fire. He saw how the escorts' weave created moving barriers, how certain altitudes offered more options, how cloud could serve as cover but also as trap. He saw that the Germans had choices too, head-on passes with heavy cannon fire, slashing attacks through the rear, coordinated dives timed with flak to overwhelm. The war was not a duel. It was a crowded system of men and machines, each one trying to solve the problem of survival with limited information. His limited information now included his own weakness. Without guns, Halstead could not truly commit to a firing pass. He could not finish an intercept. His presence was still valuable, but only if he used it deliberately. He thought about what his instructor had once said almost casually about air combat. Sometimes the threat of fire mattered as much as fire. A pilot who believed he was being targeted would break, would dump altitude, would lose position. The mind created its own vulnerability. If Halstead could make an enemy pilot believe he was armed, he might still shape their behavior. That idea came with its own risk. Bluffing meant closing distance. Closing distance meant exposure to someone who might not be fooled. Halstead weighed it not as a dramatic choice but as a calculation. The bombers were approaching the turn point that would line them up for the run. Flak bursts thickened ahead, marking gun belts along rivers and towns. Fighters remained high to the east. The Germans would likely dive as the bombers steadied for the target. That would be the moment when escorts had to be decisive, not hesitant. A bomber on the lower edge of the stream began to lag, its formation drifting slightly out of alignment. Halstead noticed it because the aircraft's contrail thinned and then broke, suggesting an engine running rough or throttled back. The bomber's position created a small bulge in the stream, an easy point for attackers to isolate. Halstead saw a pair of BF-109s peel down from the eastern group, angling toward that bomber with the smooth certainty of men who smelled advantage. His leader's attention was elsewhere for a moment, drawn toward a separate cluster of fighters higher up. Halstead realized that if no one responded immediately, the lagging bomber would take the full weight of the attack. He keyed his radio, keeping his words short. "Two diving east side going for straggler," he said. He did not add emotion. He forced his voice into the same flat tone the veterans used because sounding calm mattered. His leader acknowledged, but there was a delay, other calls, other needs. Halstead watched the BF-109s drop, their speed building. The bomber's gunners began to fire, tracers reaching up but falling behind the attacker's line. The German fighters were still far enough that a committed intercept could force them to adjust, perhaps break off. Halstead had no guns, but he had altitude and speed. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the engine respond, and rolled into a shallow dive that would put him between the attackers and their target. The Mustang accelerated quickly, the airframe humming as it cut into denser air. He held his angle carefully, not so steep that he would overshoot, not so shallow that he would arrive too late. The bomber grew larger beneath him, the German fighters larger ahead. Halstead felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that came with closing speed, the knowledge that at these velocities, small errors became catastrophic. He chose one of the BF-109s, the leader slightly ahead, and aimed not at its tail but at its path, trying to intersect it in a way that forced a reaction. He knew that if he approached from a blind spot, the German pilot might not see him until too late, and then the Germans' response could be violent and unpredictable. Halstead wanted to be seen. He wanted the enemy to know there was a fighter on their flank, close and fast, ready to fire. He brought the Mustang in from slightly above and to the side, a classic attack position, and held it steady. The BF-109 pilot saw him. Halstead could tell by the slight twitch in the German aircraft's wings, the subtle correction as the pilot registered the threat. The German turned a fraction, enough to spoil his gunnery line on the bomber. Halstead pressed closer, committing to the bluff. He felt the G-load as he adjusted his own line to stay in that threatening place. His thumb hovered on the trigger, a useless gesture, but he kept it there because he needed to believe in the illusion he was selling. For an instant, he and the German fighter were close enough that Halstead saw the canopy framing, the pilot's helmet, the pale flash of goggles. It was not a face in detail, but it was a human shape in a machine, and it made the encounter feel intimate in a way that terrified him. The German broke harder. The BF-109 rolled away from the bomber and dropped its nose, using gravity to escape the perceived threat. Halstead followed just long enough to make the break genuine, then pulled up slightly to avoid being dragged into a chase that would separate him from the bombers. He watched the second German fighter hesitate, its pilot checking his 6, and then adjusting his own pass. The bomber's gunners continued firing, and the bomber held formation as best it could, no longer facing a clean, coordinated attack. Halstead had changed the angle of the assault without firing a single round. His heart hammered against his ribs. He realized how close he had come to being caught in a lie. If the German pilot had turned toward him instead of away, Halstead would have had to evade without the ability to punish. But the enemy had reacted as Halstead hoped, not because Halstead was truly dangerous, but because the German pilot could not afford to gamble. In the air, assumptions were survival tools. A fighter behind you was assumed armed until proven otherwise, and proving otherwise took time no one had. Halstead climbed back toward the escort level, careful not to stall as he pulled through thinner air. His leader's voice came over the radio again, not praising, not theatrical, simply acknowledging a situation managed. Halstead responded with a brief confirmation. He did not feel triumphant. He felt tired, as if the brief burst of decision had drained something deeper than muscle. Yet he also felt something else, a quiet steadiness. he had contributed. He had protected a bomber for a few seconds when it mattered. He had done it with judgment rather than firepower. The bombers began their turn toward the target run, banking slowly in formation. That turn, forced by geography and aim points, was predictable, and the flak intensified as if the ground had been waiting for it. Black bursts climbed in denser clusters. Escort fighters shifted again, tightening coverage where the bomber's bank exposed different aspects. Halstead resumed his position near his leader, scanning the high east again, aware that the Germans would continue to test. His guns were still dead, but he no longer felt entirely helpless. He understood now that even a flawed machine could be useful if the man inside it kept his mind working, kept his place, and kept seeing the sky as a problem to be solved rather than a stage for heroics. He tried the trigger once more, not in desperation this time, but as a simple check, like tapping a faulty compass. The guns remained silent. He accepted it without anger. He set his thumb back on the stick and kept scanning, his eyes moving steadily across cloud, contrail, and distant speck, because that was the work that kept the formation alive. The bomber stream turned for home with no celebration, only the subtle change in headings and the gradual loosening of that tight, clenched posture the escorts had held for hours. The target lay behind them now, hidden by cloud and distance, but the sky did not immediately become safer just because bombs had fallen. German fighters still hovered in scattered groups, making final slashing passes when opportunities appeared, and flak followed them for a while, black blossoms rising even as the stream pulled away. Halstead felt the shift in his own body first. The frantic edge that had sharpened every thought began to dull, leaving behind a heavy awareness of cold fingers, sore neck muscles, and the dull ache where the harness straps had pressed into his shoulders. The war did not end at the target. It simply moved into a different phase, a long, draining return where mistakes were still lethal, but adrenaline no longer masked fatigue. Fuel became his constant companion. The needle had been dropping all morning with obedient inevitability, and now, on the homebound leg, it seemed to move faster, as if the aircraft understood it was running out of patience. Mustangs carried range by design, but escort work chewed through it. Climbs, dives, throttle changes, weaving to keep unpredictability, the subtle waste of small corrections repeated 100 times. Halstead forced himself to fly cleanly, to avoid unnecessary power changes, to hold a steady cruise where possible. He leaned the mixture carefully, watching the engine instruments for any hint of roughness. He could not afford to damage the Merlin by being too aggressive, but he also could not afford to nurse it so gently that he fell behind and became isolated. The balance was not heroic, it was arithmetic with consequences. The bomber formations began to show their wounds now that the pressure eased. A B flew with one engine feathered, its propeller a dark cross against the sky. Another bomber carried a ragged hole in its wing near the tip, metal peeled back like torn cloth. A third lagged slightly, its airspeed reduced, the rest of its box adjusting around it with the grim cooperation of men who understood that leaving someone behind was an invitation to the enemy. Halstead watched the damaged aircraft as he passed, trying not to imagine what the inside looked like. Oxygen masks dangling, spent shell casings rolling under boots, blood wiped with sleeves because there was nowhere else to put it. The bombers stayed in formation because formation was protection, and protection was all that kept them from becoming solitary targets. The German fighters did not vanish, but their attacks became less coordinated as the escorts held altitude advantage, and the bomber stream moved farther from the most heavily defended zones. Halstead saw a pair of fighters shadowing at a distance, then turning away, perhaps low on fuel themselves, perhaps unwilling to chase into the widening net of Allied air cover. The escorts continued to weave, but the movement lost its earlier urgency. It became routine again, the practiced pattern of aircraft guarding aircraft. Routine in combat was not comfort. It was simply what men did when they could not remain tense forever. Halstead tried his guns once more, not because he expected them to come alive, but because part of him could not accept being unarmed over enemy territory. The trigger produced the same dead silence, and he let his thumb rest on the stick without anger. He had already done what he could with the failure. Now his task was to bring himself and his aircraft home intact. That task demanded its own discipline, staying with the formation, avoiding temptations to chase, watching for stragglers and sudden dives, and managing fuel with the kind of care that felt almost domestic compared to the violence of combat. The Mustang's engine continued to hum steadily, and Halstead listened to it the way a sick man listened to his own heartbeat. Crossing back over the flak belt, the air changed again. The bursts grew fewer, then stopped. The ground below softened into the patchwork of occupied France, still hostile but less concentrated with defenses. The cloud layers thinned, and sunlight returned in wide sheets. Halstead glanced at his wingman and element leader, their aircraft steady, contrails trailing like thin scars. He wondered how they looked at him now, if they saw him as the careful rookie, or as simply another pilot who had survived a mission. Survival did not erase mistakes, but it did establish a baseline of competence in a squadron that measured men by whether they came back. The channel appeared as a dark, familiar stretch of water. It brought no relief exactly, but it did change the flavor of fear. Going down over the sea meant cold and drowning rather than capture and interrogation, yet the thought of being that close to home and still dying carried its own cruelty. Halstead checked fuel again and felt the needle's position like a physical pressure. He calculated distance in his head, remembered briefings about emergency procedures, and noted the locations of air-sea rescue stations marked on his map. His mind kept replaying the day in fragments. The first sight of enemy fighters, the moment his trigger did nothing, the brief, desperate improvisation as he forced a German break with nothing but position and nerve. The replay did not come with cinematic clarity. It came with small, persistent questions. Had he reacted quickly enough? Had he endangered his leader by staying too close? Had his call about the diving fighters reached the right people in time? In the air, there was rarely certainty, only outcomes. As the coast of England grew larger, the formation began to loosen further. Bombers peeled away in groups toward their own bases, each group descending gradually, leaving behind gaps in the sky. The escort fighters remained higher a little longer, then received the order to return. Halstead followed his leader on a gentle descent, careful with throttle to avoid shock cooling the engine. His body felt heavy now, as though the G-forces of the day had rearranged his insides. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves and felt stiffness. He realized he had been clenching without noticing. The airfield came into view as a small cluster of shapes, runway lines and dispersal areas, familiar and strangely vulnerable. Halstead's fuel gauge sat lower than he liked, but it was enough if nothing went wrong. He ran through the landing checks with the focus of a man who knew that accidents often happened when men thought the danger was over. Undercarriage down, flaps set, prop pitch adjusted. He listened for the reassuring thump of the gear locking. When the wheels touched the runway, the sound and vibration were almost shocking after hours of air, a sudden reminder that gravity still existed. The Mustang rolled out, tail settling, and Halstead let himself breathe in a way he hadn't managed all day. Back at dispersal, the ground crew met the returning aircraft with a mix of efficiency and restrained relief. They chalked wheels, guided pilots to their hardstands, and moved in immediately to inspect for damage. Halstead climbed down stiffly, his legs protesting as they found the ground. The corporal who had warned him to warm the engine looked up at him, eyes scanning his face before the aircraft, as if checking for holes that were not visible from outside. Halstead pulled off his helmet and felt the cold air on sweat-damp hair. For a moment he stood silently beside the Mustang, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, smelling hot oil and exhaust, feeling the delayed tremor of adrenaline leaving his hands. The debrief room was warmer than the dispersal hut had been, but the warmth only made fatigue more obvious. Pilots sat with maps and mugs again, their faces marked by oxygen mask lines. An intelligence officer asked for enemy sightings, altitudes, numbers, directions of attack. Each pilot answered in the same clipped style, trying to translate a chaotic sky into usable information. Halstead reported what he had seen and where, including the moment he warned about the diving fighters. He mentioned the gun failure without embellishment, stating it like a fact. No one laughed. The room had moved beyond that kind of humor. They wrote it down because mechanical failures mattered, because they could repeat, because they could kill. After the debrief, Halstead walked back to his aircraft where the armorers were already at work. They opened panels along the wing, exposing the gun bays. The smell changed immediately, oil, metal, and the faint, stale tang of cordite that never fully left a combat aircraft. One of the armorers ran a gloved hand along an ammunition belt and stopped where links had bunched. "There's your trouble," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. A misfeed had twisted the belt just enough to jam the mechanism. It was not dramatic, not a single broken part, just the kind of small imperfection that grew under vibration and cold until it stopped everything. Halstead watched as they worked the belt free, checked feed chutes, inspected firing solenoids and connections. The men's hands moved with confidence born of long hours, and their expressions held a kind of weary intimacy with failure. They explained in practical terms how lubrication thickened in cold, how belts could shift if not seated perfectly, how the repeated stress of operations loosened what had been tight on the ground. Halstead felt an unexpected calm as he listened. The jam had felt like a judgment in the sky, but here on ground it became part of a system. Machines pushed beyond comfort, men maintaining them in mud and frost, errors that were not moral but mechanical. Later in the mess, the squadron's tone was subdued. Men ate, smoked, and spoke in short bursts. Losses were discussed quietly with names and last known positions. Halstead heard a veteran mention his own near miss, then fall silent as if deciding not to add detail. When Halstead sat down, a pilot who had teased him earlier nodded once, a small gesture that carried more meaning than a compliment. It was not friendship yet, not trust fully formed, but it was acknowledgement. Halstead understood then that the squadron did not truly celebrate bravery. It noted composure, discipline, and the ability to keep functioning when a plan collapsed. That night in his bunk, Halstead lay awake longer than he expected. The mission ran through his mind not as a single narrative but as a series of sensations. The dead trigger, the bright tracers, the sudden closeness of a German cockpit, the slow crawl of the fuel needle. He realized that this was what endurance looked like, not a grand moment but accumulation. Each sortie added weight, each survival altered a man's shape. The laughter from the morning seemed distant and almost irrelevant, part of a younger version of himself that had not yet understood how thin the line was between routine and catastrophe, and how much of war depended on ordinary men keeping machines working one day longer. Morning returned without ceremony, a pale gray light that seeped through blackout curtains and made the edges of the room look unfinished. Halstead woke with the strange sensation that the day before had happened to someone else, and then his body reminded him it had happened to him. Stiff shoulders, a bruised feeling along his hips where the harness had held him, a dryness in his throat from hours of oxygen. Outside, the airfield sounded as it always did. Distant engines being tested, boots on gravel, the faint clatter of tools. The war did not pause to let a man absorb what it had just taken from him. It arrived again on schedule. At breakfast, the talk was quieter than it had been a week earlier, not because anyone had become solemn by choice, but because they had learned to ration emotion the way they rationed fuel. Someone read a list of aircraft that had not returned from other groups in the wing, names spoken quickly, then folded away as if the paper itself were dangerous. Halstead listened and felt the familiar tightening in his stomach, but he did not search faces for reassurance. He had seen how men carried loss here, a brief acknowledgement, then movement, because dwelling was a luxury that could break a pilot before the next sortie. The squadron was a machine of people, and machines kept moving even when parts were missing. Later at dispersal, Halstead watched the armorers work on his Mustang again. The gun bays were open and the belts lay exposed like veins. The misfeed that had jammed his guns had been corrected, but the men were checking everything around it with obsessive care. Feed pawls, links, chutes, wiring, the tiny tolerances that mattered more than courage. One of the armorers explained it in the plain language of experience. Cold, thickened lubricants. Vibration loosened fasteners. A belt that looked fine on the ground could shift under G-load and become a knot at the worst moment. Halstead realized the air war was fought not only by pilots and planners, but by thousands of hands ensuring that a trigger produced sound instead of silence. The scale of it was industrial, but the failure points were always small. He found himself paying attention in a different way now. Before, he had watched maintenance as a ritual performed by others, something that happened around him like weather. Now he stood closer, asked short questions, and listened for the details that could save his life. Which ammunition links were more likely to twist? How the heaters affected the gun bays at altitude? What signs of improper seating looked like before the panels closed? The corporal who served as his crew chief did not treat the questions as annoyance. He answered with the measured patience of a man who understood that knowledge reduced superstition. Halstead did not suddenly believe he could control everything. He simply understood better what he was trusting. The veterans noticed the change, though they did not comment on it directly. Trust in a combat unit was rarely given as a speech. It arrived as small allowances, a brief nod before a briefing, a shared cigarette, a clipped remark that assumed competence rather than weakness. Halstead's element leader, a man whose voice had stayed calm over the radio when Halstead admitted his guns were dead, began to include him more naturally in the pre-flight talk. It was not mentorship in the sentimental sense. It was the practical act of integrating a man into a system where everyone depended on everyone else. Halstead felt the shift like a coat settling onto his shoulders, still heavy, but fitting better. In the following days, the squadron's operations continued with the same relentless pattern. Targets changed, routes adjusted, but the structure remained. Briefing, takeoff, rendezvous, climb, enemy contact, return, debrief, maintenance, sleep. The air war over Germany was an evolving argument between tactics and countertactics. Bomber formations tightened or shifted. Escort fighters learned to position themselves not just as guards but as hunters, trying to break up enemy assemblies before they could dive. German pilots adapted too, using head-on attacks to exploit the bombers, forward blind spots, deploying rockets and heavy cannon from outside effective defensive ranges, and relying on the increasing density of flak to complicate Escort's choices. Every change produced another change. It was not progress so much as adaptation under pressure. Halstead began to see how his own experience fit into that larger process. A jammed gun was not a personal misfortune. It was a reliability problem that commanders had to account for across thousands of sorties. Aircraft were built in vast numbers, but their performance depended on components that could fail in cold air at 25,000 feet. Factories produced belts and links by the million, yet a single bent link could erase the firepower of an entire fighter. Ground crews compensated with procedures and inspections, but time was always short. The airfield was not a laboratory. It was mud, frost, and exhausted men working by torchlight. In that environment, perfection was an aspiration, not a guarantee. The squadron's leadership responded in the way wartime organizations often did, by turning individual mishaps into standard practice. Armorers double-checked belt seating on returning aircraft scheduled for the next day. Pilots were reminded to test firing circuits at safe moments when possible, to note any irregularities, and to report them without embarrassment. Halstead saw how shame could be dangerous, how a pilot who hid a malfunction for fear of ridicule might carry that malfunction into the next fight. The veterans' teasing, he realized, was not the core culture. The core culture was honesty about what could kill you and respect for anyone who learned quickly. Halstead's own confidence changed shape. It did not grow louder. If anything, it became quieter, less interested in proving something and more interested in being useful. He stopped thinking about how he looked when he flew and started thinking about what his position did for the formation. He practiced his scans until they felt like muscle memory. He rehearsed radio calls in his head, compressing observations into clean phrases. He began to anticipate the way enemy fighters gathered, recognizing patterns in how they used sunlight and altitude. None of it made him invincible. It simply made him less surprised, and surprise was what killed men in the air. One afternoon, as they prepared for another operation, Halstead found himself standing beside his element leader at the map table. The route line ran once again across the channel and into the continent, arcing toward an industrial region shaded heavily on the chart. The briefing officer spoke about weather fronts and expected resistance, about fuel margins and emergency fields, about flak concentrations around the target. The language was familiar now, and Halstead noticed that his mind did not recoil from it. He absorbed the information and began to build the flight in his head. Climb profile, escort position, likely fighter approach, the timing of turns. He still felt anxiety, but it was braided into preparation rather than panic. At dispersal, his Mustang waited with its panels closed again, looking smooth and indifferent, as if it had never betrayed him. Halstead ran his hand along the wing root and felt cold metal under his glove. He watched the crew chief's final checks, saw the armorer's thumbs up, and understood that trust here was never blind. It was a decision made repeatedly, sortie after sortie, based on the best workmen could do under imperfect conditions. He climbed into the cockpit and strapped in with the practiced motions of someone who had done it enough times for the sequence to become reassuring. When he checked the gun switches, he did it without superstition, simply confirming what needed to be confirmed. Engines started across the field, each one catching with its own cough and roar, and the air became thick with prop wash. The squadron taxied out in ordered lines, aircraft weaving gently to see ahead, ground crewmen watching them go with faces unreadable. Halstead held his place, aligning his aircraft with the one ahead, feeling the brakes bite, adjusting throttle in small increments. The runway stretched forward, wet and dark. Beyond it lay the same sky that had tested him, and the same war that did not care about individual narratives. He no longer expected it to be fair. At the end of the runway, the lead aircraft paused. Halstead looked left and right and saw other fighters poised in the same moment of suspension, each cockpit holding a man with his own private calculations. The radio crackled with the final clearances. Halstead's hands were steady on the controls. He did not feel brave. He felt ready in the only way readiness existed here, trained, tired, and committed. When the signal came, he advanced the throttle and felt the Mustang surge forward, the tail lifting, the ground turning into blur, and then the wheels were no longer touching anything. The air took him again, and the squadron climbed into another day of escort work, another line on a map becoming a lived reality because that was how the air war continued, by repetition, by endurance, and by men who learned quietly how to keep going.